When you go to teach your students the full range chromatic scale, just have them turn to page 70 and look at that full range chromatic scale. This scale can really be very daunting. A good friend of mine used to call it the traumatic scale. So before you tackle this scale, please teach your students the chromatic chunks, because that breaks it into a smaller segment so that they can not just try to tackle this monstrous scale that's, in some of the books it's 4 lines long. Try to memorize something like that. It's very difficult. So just have them go back and do the chromatic chunks first. The full range chromatic scale is the chromatic scale defined by GMEA for the first round 6th through 8th grade all-state audition. The full range chromatic scale is going to use sharps when it's ascending and flats when it's descending. This notation can be very confusing for young players who tend to struggle with those enharmonic notations, like seeing a D sharp and flute players knowing that a D sharp is equal to an E flat. That sometimes that blows their mind a little bit. So I just tell my students to look up each pitch that they have come across in the chromatic scale that they don't know in the fingering chart, and make sure that the fingering that they looked up also matches with the annotations that are below the pitches, because often in the chromatic scale, especially on a woodwind instrument, the fingering is going to be different than the one that they're used to using. Like the B flat fingering on the saxophone, they're going to use a different fingering than they usually use, and same thing on the flute. And there's a lot of exceptions or alternate fingerings that we use in the chromatic scale, so that when you go really fast, especially on a woodwind instrument, then your fingers are going to move in a more ergonomic fashion and not get bleeps and blops. So just make sure that using those annotations and learning them back into chromatic chunks, and then applying them again when they get to the full range chromatic. So this is a lot of effort to do all of this study for a lot of students. So while I'm working with one instrument group, I tell the other instrument group to study those letter names, look at the fingering chart, touch them. A lot of kids are really tactile, and it really helps them, especially with all their new touch devices. If you will get them to touch stuff, then they can get it a little bit better than if they're just looking at it for a while. So touch the letter, touch the fingering in the fingering chart, touch the annotation, make sure that the annotation matches the fingering that they've picked in the fingering chart. And then oftentimes they'll get off task. Like, I'm working with the flutes for 5 minutes. That's a long time in middle school land. That can seem like an hour to them, and they have already zoned out. So, you may have to stop teaching the flutes and address everybody and get everybody back on task studying again. So the chromatic scales are not designed to be played as a full band. Okay, a lot of the stuff, the majority of the stuff in this book is designed where you can play it as a full band, but chromatic scales you cannot. When teaching them, you should work, like I said, work with the flutes, and then the other students are studying or airing and fingering if they've already got the study part down. And then once the flutes get a good grasp of the scale, you want to move on to the next group, the oboes and then the bassoons, and then while the other students are studying, while you're doing that, the other students got to be studying. They got to be studying, airing and fingering. Don't let up on that. Really demand that they're actually studying during this time, and that will make it so that when you get down to the clarinets or you get down to the trumpets, they will actually, hopefully, be ready because they've studied. And I would definitely not go through all instruments in one class period. It's just going to be too long. Their attention span is going to wane long before you get, and it will be diminishing returns on your time. So I would try to do 2 or 3 instruments per class period, and after I teach it and the kids have a pretty good grasp on it, I don't model it anymore, and I don't teach individual groups. I just let them all play it together. So every time you do a study session on the chromatic scale, you want to end it with just letting them all play at once. I know it'll sound terrible, and you won't even be able to tell if kids are on task or not, but hopefully they will be, because the last 5 to 7 minutes you've been actually studying the scale, and hopefully then they're like, finally, now I can finally play it. So it's going to sound terrible, but it will really develop them, especially if you give them a little bit of time every day to play their chromatic chunks or their chromatic scale. Practice this scale slowly at 66 beats per minute. I think it's marked in eighth notes. You can slow it down to quarter notes or half notes or whole notes, whatever, when you're learning it, and then gradually get it up to what's notated on the page. Learn it at 66, and then gradually, over time, speed it up to 120 beats per minute. Some instruments may not be able to do it especially if you're a middle school band director. They may not be able to do it at 120 beats per minute like a tuba. Doing a chromatic scale that fast is pretty intense, but some of my kids can do it. So have them play the scale over and over until they memorize it. Try to stay positive, especially with this scale, because it can be very, just daunting to see so many notes and so many notes that they don't know, and try to just stay positive and talk to them about the gains that they're making, and try to keep them happy with, oh man, you did so much better than you did yesterday.